say, okay, we have this structural defect. Now, the manufacturer's making the claim that it's just due to weathering, or it's just due to random conditions of, say, wear and tear. And I'm called in to do an analysis and to see if that actually is a reasonable explanation, or is it actually more likely due to the fact that there was negligence on the part of the manufacturer either in making it or installing it. That's an intelligent design argument.
Yeah,
And no
absolutely.
one would say that I'm not doing scientific work when I'm doing that. It's absolutely
Hmm.
unheard of. Engineers do it all the time. Like, one of the most common things for engineers to do is make intelligent design inferences. That's what they have to do on a
Hmm.
daily basis. All fault analysis is intelligent design inference. And I started to say these things, and people just went like right off the rails.
Hmm.
Weren't even listening to what I was saying. They were just saying, "Oh, so you're intelligent design. So you also are a young earther?" And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Okay." So,
Uh,
like, what difference does that make? Let's say
no.
I believe in, something crazy or whatever. What does that got to do with what I'm saying? Like, I could believe in
Hmm.
leprechauns. That doesn't make my argument about intelligent design have any impact on it. Like,
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's why like I've been kind of steering away from some of those hangouts because it's like it's not worth it. It's inefficient. Nobody's actually listening to what I'm saying most of the time. So there's not really like a conversation. Like I can have a conversation with you. I can have a conversation with Joe, who absolutely disagrees with intelligent design. Nevertheless, I can have a conversation about it. And I know that I can have a conversation with Helena because we've talked about some other things where we disagreed, and it was great conversation. Um, but most people who have these hangouts, they don't even listen. Like you will say something and they will respond to something completely different as though they're responding to what you just said, but they're not. So but yeah, I mean the design inference, that's a real science. I mean, there are all kinds of sciences that use the design inference. I mean, this is uncontroversial, or it should be. It's only within the context of like the origin of life or things like that it becomes controversial. I can understand that there are some distinctions there, but just the idea that science doesn't infer intelligent cause ever, that's absurd.
I don't even know how to respond to that. Like, when someone says something like that, and they say things like, "There's absolutely no evidence for intelligent design," and I even said to one guy, I said, "Look, the argument you're making now is so extremely wrong. It's the exact same thing that when someone like Nephilim Free says there's no evidence for evolution."
Mm,
I say, look, now we might disagree
mm,
over what you can infer from certain
yeah.
pieces of evidence. We might disagree over what the various proposed mechanisms can explain and what they can't explain. But you can't
Mm,
generalize and say there's no such thing or there's no evidence for something. That's silly. That's just as
yeah.
silly as saying there's no evidence for intelligent design. But like, one of the critical questions, like if you're talking to Joe, I'd say, well, Joe, but you infer intelligent design all the time. Like, he's an anthropologist. One of the
Mm,
main questions in anthropology is inferences of intelligent design.
mm,
So how come you're allowed to do it?
mm. Yeah. Well, I think that you raised a really important point too. That even wrong ideas can have evidence for them. I mean, isn't that what science is all about anyway? I mean, you have competing hypotheses, each of them citing their own sets of evidences, and then yet one turns out to be wrong and the other turns out to be right. That doesn't mean that all along the one that lost never had any evidence for it. It also doesn't mean that the one that lost or turned out to be wrong doesn't still have evidence for it. It's just the case that the hypothesis that won out had better evidence.
For the time being.
Right. So just because you think an idea might be wrong, it doesn't mean automatically that there is no evidence for it. Like I think there is evidence for um, well, universal common descent, although I'm skeptical of it. But I'm not going to say that there's no evidence of it.
I think like the problem is a lot of the times is that on both sides, people are sort of shotgunning things that they've heard on the other side claim without really understanding like what they're saying. So just as like Nephilim will say there's no evidence for evolution, someone will say there's no evidence for intelligent design, or intelligent design is not a science. And the other thing that comes across to me is it's really problematic is that oftentimes both sides can feel like if they concede one thing, it's like a mortal sin. So like you got to oppose everything or like the gods of science come down and kick you out of the club. You know what I mean? So that's why like
Yeah.
I just find it I don't know, it's kind of frustrating on one level but kind of silly on another for people to say extreme things like that. Like I think you
Yeah.
can ask interesting questions, but I think the interesting questions tend to be a lot more nuanced than some of the questions that get asked.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think some of the unwillingness to budge even a fraction of a centimeter and just grant things like, okay, yeah, I disagree with your position, but I will agree that there is evidence that you can cite in support of it. The reason people don't want to say that, I think, is because of all of this childishness that we see in these hangouts and the comment sections. And it's just ridiculous. Like people are calling other people retarded. Like, I mean, does it get
I've
more
got no time for
childish?
that. Yeah, I've got no time for that at
I
all. I
mean,
mean, like, it just if you are uneducated on a subject,
uh-huh.
oftentimes you will say things which appear to be very silly to someone who is educated on a subject. What most of these people forget, or some of them maybe never experience, is that at some point you have to start learning a subject. At that point, you are that person asking those questions.
Mm-hmm.
And people who are learned about a subject and who are not total idiots don't
Mm-hmm.
react like that because at one point they realize, oh yeah, I was there at one point too,
Mm-hmm.
and I said the same silly things, and the
Yeah.
guy I was asking them from didn't call me a retard because at one point he was there too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people just need to grow up. I mean, let's have a conversation, you know? There was a recent exchange on G Plus. I think it was Outer Al, and he was talking about the mysterious gravity anomaly spot. I think it's called something similar to that. I think I butchered it there, but basically it's like in certain spots you can stand and it's like you're diagonal, or like people look like they're different sizes, or a ball will roll uphill or something like that. And a lot of it's probably optical illusion or whatever. But you know, the thing is that Outer Al, he seemed to think it was mysterious, right? There's nothing wrong with saying that this is a really cool mystery. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But then Steve comes in and he's dropping like F bombs, calling him
What?
effing retard for believing this, that there's a gravitational anomaly. And the situation was simply that Outer Al thought it was an interesting thing, and you know, Steve just jumped all over him because Steve had like read all about it and stuff and thought he was completely stupid for even posting about it. I'm like, hey, I think it's pretty cool. I don't care what's causing it, but I pointed out that in the picture of Outer Al's post, it had a big sign that said mystery. And like, isn't that what somebody who doesn't understand what's going on should think of this as? A mystery? Like, there's nothing at all wrong with that. And yet Steve jumps down his throat, calls, like, he's very insulting and you know, cursing at him and stuff. It's just ridiculous. But I
Yeah,
think that's why people have such a hypersensitivity to giving even a little inch on their position.
Yeah, I don't get that at all, and I think I'm biased towards it because of my background. But I mean, like, when you start studying beyond like sort of a high school level, um, you you're always in situations. I mean, like when you're given problem sets in high school and even sort of introductory courses in college, they teach you a method and then they ask you a problem set related to that method. So you're just learning something. Once you get beyond that, it's always a case where you're having to extrapolate from what they told you, try to figure things out, fill in the gaps, because they're teaching you like how to solve problems in the real world. You're always in that struggle. You never know what you're supposed to be doing. You're trying to find solutions. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what science is about. And science and higher maths are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always thinking, and so you're thinking about and postulating these ideas, which are true, which are false, which you don't know. You're talking about them. Most of them are wrong. Like before you get to the right answer, you postulate like maybe 20, 30, maybe possible ways to try to figure something out, and they all turn out to be wrong. But that's how you get to a right solution. So no one ever criticizes someone for postulating a wrong answer because that's like you're doing it continuously beyond introductory level stuff, which is why like I just find it really funny when these people jump over somebody for
Mm-hmm.
postulating something that they find is silly. Well, they're
Yeah.
trying to learn, they're trying to understand. That's what you do, that's part of the
Yeah.
process.
And it was even worse in that case because Outer Owl, he wasn't even postulating anything. He was just saying it's this really cool mystery. That was it. So it wasn't even, there was no hypothesis to be wrong. He was just saying, this is an awesome mystery, which I agree with. It was really cool. I mean, I think we understand what's going on, but, you know, at that time, actually, I didn't understand everything about it, but, now I do. But I don't know. It's just really hostile and unnecessary and just an impediment to
Yeah, I think
conversation.
there's people on both sides that do that, and I mean sometimes.
Yeah, I think so
So
too.
Steve can get wound up because of uh, maybe it's a conversation he had before, but he tends like
Mm,
he's kind of high strung in some cases. But I have a bit of sympathy for Steve because he often has a lot of these conversations with some of the most inflammatory people on YouTube.
yeah.
And the
Mm,
problem is, and like I tried to talk to them for a while, like Nephilim. The
mm,
problem is though, like it's very dangerous to talk to them because you get into this sort of antagonistic mindset because
mm,
that's the way they are. And I remember
mm,
once I had a conversation with like a normal person, and like 5 minutes into it, I realized, holy shit, I'm talking to him like he's Nephilim free. This is a really horrible thing that I'm doing here. Like, because I had just come out of a conversation with Nephilim the day before, and the
yeah.
guy was saying similar sort of things, and I was reacting to him from like a holdover I had with Nephilim, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, this is not a productive way to have
Yeah.
conversations with people. And I think like a lot of the conversations Steve has are like that.
Yeah.
So when you go into a conversation with him and you're like, well, I think an argument could be made that intelligent design is science, he automatically has you locked into that wingnut box. So he responds to you in that manner.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate.
Yeah. It's like a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just need to reset. That's what we need to do. Everybody just needs to reset their YouTube channels, their G plus, everything. Start fresh.
Yeah. It's, I think you hit on it. Like about, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a hangout with Rose Patton, and Rose is a big conspiracy theorist. And like even small things she will reach conclusions based on. And we were just talking about a bunch of things in the hangouts. And in the hangout, I was there for about an hour and a half. I didn't even support the positions she was making. I wasn't saying, yeah, Rose, I agree with that. I think your conclusions are valid. That's a good argument. I never said that once. But because I didn't tear into her, a bunch
Mm-hmm.
of people flipped out at me. Like, because you're supposed to do that. Like, you're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to flip out at these people. And if you don't do that, that's
Mm-hmm.
enough to get people to flip out at you. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, she's not hurting me by thinking some things that I think are, unsound, whatever.
Mm-hmm. That's funny because Steve then flipped out on me in the comments for not flipping out on Outer Owl
Yeah.
for his post. And like it was weird because he totally like, I don't know, kind of lost his marbles a little bit because he addressed a comment to me and then he was like, I wasn't even saying that to you. I was obviously talking to Outrao. I was like, you tagged my name and said the word you. And he's like, no, obvious. Like he was denying this. It is right there. He didn't even like go up and edit it to make it sound like I was lying. Like it's right there. So it's just like crazy. It's mindless. Like people go bonkers. It's weird. Yeah, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to having a chat with Helena because I think she's one additional person that I think I can have a conversation with, like an additional non-theist I could have a conversation with. And she seems pretty open to it. Like she asks me questions and stuff, and um, I mean, you know, as opposed to just assuming that you know somebody else's position, and furthermore that you know why it's wrong. Like
Yeah,
she,
Helena has one of the strongest positions on G plus in terms of right to discourse. She believes very strongly in the fact that people, regardless of what position they have, should be given right to free discourse. Like that's one of her fundamental positions, and she will argue that for even extreme claims. Like she believes that people, for example, who deny the Holocaust happened should be given free right to speech. Now, I will draw the line at some point because I believe there are some positions which are indefensible and which are extremely dangerous. So openly advocating them, I think, can have harsh consequences. But I can understand her position. We've talked about it a few times.
hmm,
And I won't even argue that I know that I'm right. For me, it's just a line that I'm not willing to cross. But of course, so if you talk about intelligent design, she will strongly want to hear what you're saying because she fundamentally believes in that right to discourse, and she's not at all hostile, because
yeah.
like that would be contrary to one of her core beliefs. So
Mm.
yeah.
Oh yeah, I like that. That's cool. Hmm. So what did I say I was going to make the topic about?
Uniformitarianism.
Oh yeah, I have uniformitarianism, and then also, can my fellow theists articulate what intelligent design even is? These are both really good topics, I think. That second one just came to me in the last like half hour because I feel like there are so few theists who can actually articulate intelligent design. So like there's a part of me that says I can't really blame non-theists for being uncharitable because it's not like theists are articulating intelligent design very well. And actually, Max, I think his name's Max. I was in a hangout. They were going to do a debate with true empiricism, but he was late. So I jumped in there and I pointed out to them, I don't think you're describing intelligent design accurately. And they're like, oh, well, that's not intentional. It's just what this other guy was explaining to us. So, I can't always blame the non theist for getting it wrong. They're not always intentionally straw manning, but it's like, man, maybe I need to have a talk with theists about this, because I'm always trying to talk with non theists. Maybe it's theists who I need to talk to about it with.
Yeah, that's why I thought it'd be very interesting um, when Joe was talking to True Empiricism. If you had been in the room, I thought that would have been a very interesting conversation for quite a number of reasons. One, I think you would have leveled out the hostility, but I think you would have been able to clarify the position a little bit more.
Yeah, um, yeah, that would have been a good conversation. Well, I feel like it had the potential to be a good conversation. Who knows what would have actually happened? But yeah. And then, like, one example is I was talking with, I think it was Tommy one time, and there were a bunch of atheists in the hangout as well. And I think Tommy was kind of being put on the spot a little bit. And at one point, I mean, I was asking questions to atheists and to Tommy. And one of the questions I asked Tommy was, what's the difference between your position and a God of the Gaps position? And he was quite content to say, I don't know that there is really a difference.
Wow.
Which was frustrating to me because one of the first things I always end up arguing. Hold on a second. Hey, sorry about that. One of the first things I always end up arguing with the atheist or non-theist or the anti-idea is that intelligent design is not structured like a God of the Gaps argument. That is not the structure of the argument. So agree or disagree, it is not a God of the Gaps argument. And it's very easy to explain why. Because intelligent design says that these features are best explained by intelligent cause. Non-intelligent cause isn't known to produce these features. That's not God of the Gaps. It's citing positive evidence. And it just seems like it should be so simple, but it's not, though. You know, it's just weird that it seems like it's difficult for theists who should be really interested in advancing these arguments. It's just strange to me.
I think what happened there was that that argument was used for a long time, and it merged into, um, like it was like I've seen it ID presented as that way quite a number of times. And the problem is, like, our brains have this really good feature, and it's a really bad feature. Um, shit, at both the same time. And it's like oftentimes the first thing that gets into our head gets in there very strongly, and it's very difficult to overwrite that with new information.
Yeah, I have to admit that when I was first learning about intelligent design, it was hard for me to understand how it's not saying that, oh, certain things are just so complex that nature couldn't have done it. It took me a little bit to understand the proper way to articulate the argument, and it's not that. It's not that things are just so complex. I mean, there are probabilistic arguments that can kind of resemble that, but I think there's a distinction there even. So I guess my point of view is after like reading about this for the past like 10, 15 years. hmm.
But I mean, I don't think the solution to it is, impossible. I think all it takes is some decent conversations on both sides to sort of flesh out what the argument is and what it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think that in some of my other hangouts, I have been able to, at the very least, explain what it isn't. Like I was in a hangout, Red was in there. And even with Red, he ended up saying, okay, even if it's not structured like a God of the Gaps, And then he said it could still be a god of the gaps, which I don't agree with. But
Even if you don't say it, I'm going to make it anyway.
but we at least made progress in that he recognized what I was saying. He recognized that it's not structured as a god of the gaps argument, even if he nevertheless believes it is god of the gaps argument while acknowledging it's not structured like one. But nevertheless, that's a little bit of something, though. So I think you're right. It is possible. The problem is not insurmountable.
Yeah, I think it's difficult though, and I mean it has to be difficult for you because a lot of atheists are very biased against non-atheists. And there is again that sort of like, I have to disagree with him or I lose my atheist badge. So you get that part. I don't get that because people don't think they have to disagree with me. But still, if I bring that up, there's this, and like I said, I brought up just what I thought was like a very non-controversial thing, that there are professionals who everyone acknowledges are scientists doing scientific work, and they're making inferences to intelligent design, and no one flips out about it. I thought that was completely not controversial, and yet like the discussion could not continue just because I said that.
Yeah. Well, you see, you were the traitor. You became the traitor. That's even worse than me. Whatever they think I am. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that comes down to the definitional things, the semantic things, like, yeah, but even in like forensic science and all that stuff, you're still positing a natural cause because you're still positing human beings which are made of matter, which are just material. So, as if intelligence as if that rules out intelligent cause. As if that rules out the intelligent cause that you're making an inference to.
Well, that's one of the arguments that I made. I said, you're not actually doing that. In cases where professional consultants are brought in, they're usually not brought in to make the argument that it was a person doing it. They're brought in to make the argument that it is unreasonable to assume natural processes did it. That's the argument that they make, and then somebody else then makes that argument, okay, well, blah, 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 and now they make an inference. But they're brought in purely on a negation. So you look at causes like weathering, you look at random patterns of defects and stuff like this, and you make an argument, could this have caused what we see? And you say no, and you make an argument that's for no for a bunch of technical reasons. And that's where you stop. And then the intelligent design inference comes from that. And then you can talk about the characteristics of the designer. But even if, you're going to reject, well, I'm not going to allow the postulation of a supernatural designer. Okay, well, like that's step two. In order to get to step two, have you accepted intelligent design now? And now we're going to argue about what the designer must be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. I was involved in an interesting conversation where the old question of name a naturalistic theory that was overturned by supernatural theory. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's kind of easy, actually. Super just means it supersedes, it's above or outside of. So supernatural just means it's above or outside of what is natural. So how do we make that distinction between natural and something else? Well, we say something's naturally occurring or it's man-made, or somebody died of natural causes, or they were murdered. In each case, a mind played a role in the outcome for the alternative to being natural. So therefore, let's say you've got a criminal case or a death that was once thought to have been naturally occurring. And then some evidence emerges, and now you know that there was actually foul play involved. So now it's a murder case. So that when you break down the language, that would be a case where a naturalistic theory is replaced by a theory about something that supersedes the natural cause, which, by the way we use the language, would be an intelligent cause.
Yeah, that's non-controversial, as I thought, and very commonly done all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But
But I just like to play around with the language because it's this language that people use to categorically dismiss the design inference. And I just kind of enjoy sometimes going down the rabbit trail and showing, well, even doing that, even using words like supernatural, you still don't get to categorically dismiss the design inference.
yeah, I think there's two interesting arguments there, and I think they get blended together, which does a disservice to both of them. And one is, can we make an argument for intelligent design? And the other one is, can we make an argument for supernatural causation? And I think there are two very distinct arguments, and I think blending them together makes a mess out of the argument.
Well, I mean, I think what you'd have to say then is that there is a distinction to be made between natural and supernatural. I think colloquially, maybe you can think of there are specific things we think of as being supernatural, but I think when you break down the way we actually use the language, it's actually pretty hard to make that distinction.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's a very interesting topic. It's a very interesting question to ask. What is a meaningful definition of supernatural?
Mm.
And then once we have established what we mean by supernatural, ask questions like, how do you infer a supernatural event happen? How do you infer supernatural causes? What does a situation look like that has been supernaturally influenced? I think these are interesting things. But I think that's a different question than you have when Behe and Dembski and Meyer and these people are saying, like, look, we want to argue for, we are arguing for a position of intelligent design. I don't think it does justice to the position to say that, well, all you're basically arguing for is supernatural. So we're not going to accept that because there's no part of
Yeah.
supernatural in science.
Yeah.
I think like that's completely missing the question that they're asking. And it's asking another interesting question, which is, can you have supernatural causation in science? Which I don't think is a trivial question to say yes or no to. But I don't think it's the same question. But I think in some cases, I think the reason why people do that, although it may be just a guess, is because a lot of people find it easier to argue against that than against intelligent design inference. Or they'll say something like, well, all you're saying is creationism. You're just using different words.
Yeah. Yeah. Like making an argument without actually making an argument. I mean, that's what a categorical dismissal is. You presume to have answered the argument by reference to a category, by appealing to a category, which says nothing about the actual argument. I mean, what's important is not the word that you use, it's the meaning of the word. So if you categorically dismiss something, you assign it to a poorly defined category, then you haven't really gotten anywhere. And that's especially the case with the word supernatural, I think.
Yeah, it's almost problematic in the way that the word, the actual roots of it, as in where the like supernatural itself, I think it's like you would want natural in a completely different word. I think would make it easier to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I mean, when you talk about that something was designed. No one, when you ask, or you ask an anthropologist like Joe, was that designed? You don't mean supernatural, and which is the problem I have when people make that jump. What you basically mean is, was there intention behind it? Was that created by something for a specific purpose to do something that was the will of some particular agent? That's essentially what you're asking in less wordy terms. Or did that just happen by sort of random weathering and, sort of events in the natural world without any actual kind of causation behind it or intention behind it? That's the question that you're asking. And nobody gets upset when you ask it, except when you ask it apparently about biological systems, which is a bit weird.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when you get down to biology and a lot of the specific intelligent design arguments, I think it's interesting because it's not exactly the same as other cases where we use the design inference. At least it seems to me that you can at least say that there's a difference there because, well, for a number of reasons, the designing agent is not directly observable. It must have qualities that we're not familiar with. Like at the very least, it doesn't exist on this planet, I would say, etc. So I think you could say that there's a difference, but it's a question of whether you can dismiss the argument altogether based on any of these differences. I think that's a real central question.
I don't think though, like you could propose a hypothetical situation where, like, let's go back in time, not very long ago, like just go back in time a couple of 100 years. Now, let's imagine in that society they were to do some kind of, archaeological dig or whatever, and they're able to find like an advanced computing machine, like something that we have now, and are able to somehow get power to it and get it to turn on and realize what this thing does. Now, that's completely beyond their capability to make. Like, not only is it completely beyond their capability to make, it's beyond their capability to imagine they could ever make that. Because the things that we're making now are fantastical to even think about a short period of time ago. Because, like, as you get technology, it allows you to make more technology that you couldn't have even dreamed of. So, but those people back then who found these things, like, some kind of advanced calculator or something like that they could turn on, all of a sudden it's doing all these crazy things. I don't think people like Steve, if they had found that, would jump to the conclusion that it's supernatural in any way or shape or form. I think they would still make an argument that it's designed, and it wouldn't bother them that they had never observed anything which could make this. That wouldn't bother them whatsoever. It wouldn't bother them that they couldn't even imagine they could make it, that it was totally beyond them to ever dream that they could make something like this. And I think it would be perfectly reasonable. And I'm almost guaranteed sure that the same people who are arguing against intelligent design now would be very strongly arguing that that thing was intelligently designed.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think when you apply the logic in any other scenario, the absurdity becomes completely obvious. Like, obviously, you would say that this is designed despite having no experience with that kind of intelligent cause. You still recognize that it's an intelligent cause that probably played the role. But then this is where the question of uniformitarianism comes up, because you're explaining the effect by reference to familiar causes, right? So the only reason you're able to infer intelligent cause is because you're familiar with the effects of intelligence, right? But then the problem is, this is the thing that I get all the time, and I'm trying to come up with a good response to it. I mean, it's clearly absurd, but articulating why is sometimes difficult. So if you're applying uniformitarianism here, then you have to also say, Well, yeah, but the only intelligent cause that we're familiar with is humans. So are you saying it had to be a human that did this? Which I don't think you're obligated to, but it's difficult to argue with if you're applying uniformitarianism, which I think clearly you are.
I don't think that inference is made. Like, I've seen people make that argument a bunch of times. Like, they'll say, well, wait now. What you're actually saying is that you've observed people do this. So the only thing that you could possibly infer is that people caused this, but you can't really be saying that people design the cells that people are made from, are you? And in fact, I've seen this come up really recently. Someone almost made this exact same argument. But of course, you're not. And it's not fair to say that, well, I've observed this feature coming from this organism. Therefore, it has to be that organism if I see the results of this feature somewhere else. Because we definitely don't do that. Like, for example, um, let's say that you only observed the only animal that you know that walks is a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So you've observed dogs make footprints,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you know that from locomotion, and you know a lot about footprints and tracks. So as
Mm-hmm.
grounds get softer, tracks get steeper, all this kind of stuff. And you make a bunch of inferences about um, the size of dogs based on the tracks and all this kind of stuff. If you see another track that's massively different than the track that a dog makes, and you would then make the argument, well, like, I know dogs are the only thing we've seen make tracks, and we can infer a lot about tracks from what we know about dogs. But I
Mm-hmm.
think in that case, you'd make an argument that whatever made that track was not very dog-like. It was just exhibiting properties found in dogs. Like, it was locomotive, you could make an effect that it had four legs. You could make an argument that it was heavier or lighter than a dog. You can make an argument based on the speed that it walked or ran, based on the stride length and all this kind of stuff. But you would not restrict yourself to saying it had to be a dog, because you
Right.
would be talking about properties of the dog, as in it walked or it ran or did this kind of thing.
Right.
And no one would make that objection. Wait now, you've only ever seen dogs, so you can't make a hypothesis that there's some non-dog, because we
Mm-hmm.
make those arguments all the time, that there's some unknown creature that we've never observed, or there's some unknown effect that we've never, like, for example, at one time we didn't know about nuclear forces. At one time, we didn't know a lot about things, but we knew the idea that there was this thing called a force and how it acted. So we started making ideas. Well, okay, we observe something. Maybe it's due to a force similar to gravity, but it doesn't act on mass. It acts on something else, and that's what's causing this. We do that all the time. We never restrict ourselves to a thing which has a property. We talk about properties, and maybe there
Yeah.
could be other things which have those properties.
Yeah, definitely. Now it's one thing to point out that it's clearly absurd to say that you're obligated to perfectly uniform explanations. It's another thing to articulate exactly why this is absurd. And what I've been thinking about is that I think uniformitarianism perhaps obligates you to consider the fully uniform cause, right? But you have to go beyond that, and you have to see what qualities of the uniform cause are you able to eliminate from the inference. So, like the dog example, let's say it's a hoofed creature made the footprints, but you've never seen one. You've only seen dogs. Well, the starting point from uniformitarianism is, okay, I know that dogs make footprints. This has qualities of the prints from dogs. Now the next step is, can I infer that a dog did this? Well, then you look and it has some qualities of dog prints, but then it's hoofed. and you don't. That's different from a dog. Well, you can reasonably eliminate that a dog created these kinds of footprints, or at least one that you're familiar with. But you are still obligated to a few other conclusions, that it's a four-legged entity, that it had a gait, and things like that. Like, uniformitarianism still obligates you to these other things that you were not able to eliminate from the inference. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this. That's the best that I can come up with right now, is that I think uniformitarianism probably does initially obligate you to at least consider the fully uniform explanation. But it's not the last step. That's just the first step. The second step is, what elements of the uniform explanation can we eliminate from the inference? And I think that's the real process we actually go through. You can point to specific examples of that. And that, I think, is the thought process that, that makes it obvious that it's absurd to think that the explanation has to be 100% uniform.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely wouldn't be. Like, if you just go back to the dog thing, if you saw something, like if you see a bird's tracks, they're very similar to a dog's tracks in many respects, but they're very different. And if someone said, "Oh yeah, I know what made those tracks," and drew out a picture of a bird, would you reject it because it's not dog-like in every aspect?
Right.
You wouldn't. Like, the only things that you would expect to be dog-like are the things that you can nail down, have to be causally related to the phenomena that you're seeing. So, like, if it had tracks and it didn't have feet, then you'd say, I can't possibly see how that could be making the tracks. Like, it has to be dog-like in that respect. Otherwise, I can't see. Like, there's no way a snake thing that you drew, whatever that is, could have made the tracks, because how would it do it without feet?
Yeah, and I think that to go even further with it, I think you are then obligated by uniformitarianism to consider the qualities of the uniform cause that you've parsed out from the qualities that you can disqualify. You are obligated to consider that the cause possessed those qualities. And I think you would have to you'd have to somehow be able to preclude that an entity possessing those qualities can exist in order to break down the inference. And if you can't preclude that an entity possessing those qualities can exist, if you can't preclude that a non-uniformitarian entity can exist that also possesses those qualities, then the inference stands. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, is to rule that out. I mean, you basically have to prove a universal negative, which is probably not even possible. So I think that the task for those who want to disqualify the design inference is a lot more, what's the word, foreboding? I'm not sure, but it's a lot more difficult than what they realize.
Yeah, the problem is it never gets there, right?
Oh, yeah, never.
It never even gets close to this point in the conversation.
No, definitely not. Which is why I like talking to you and Joe and Helena.
But it's difficult, I think, at times. But I think it might be helpful, because one of the things that I plan to try the next time somebody brings it up is just asking them, okay, how come we can't ask that question? How come it's invalid? How come it's not science? How come you can't infer intelligent design? Because I'm not sure what they're thinking. They're just throwing out blanket statements like it's not science, or there's no evidence for it, or something like that. But like, that really doesn't tell me what they're actually thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the categorical dismissal. It pretends to be an argument, but without actually arguing anything. You just slap an arbitrary label on something, and all of a sudden you don't have to give it any attention.
Yeah.
And then we never get into uniformitarianism and things like that. So we never get to the interesting stuff. You know? So, well, I probably should get going. I've got some sick kids, and
Hopefully nothing serious.
Yeah. It's just it's we've got like we're taking care of them and everything, but it's the kind of thing that's just keeping them up all night is the thing. So
That can be just as hard on you as it is on them.
Oh yeah, probably harder. But I think these kinds of conversations are worth it because these are the really important questions: uniformitarianism and stuff like that. So, and how do I talk to fellow theists about this too?
Yeah, it's unfortunate in some respect your schedule is so hectic. I'd really like. I think it'd be really interesting if, like, say, me, you, Helena, True Empiricism, even if we could calm G-Man down for a few minutes and try to have a conversation with him, because he makes this kind of argument in a kind of crazy sort of way, and just see if, like, we could come to an understanding of what we're actually talking about, and then B, how do you actually make the inferences? What are some of the real problems? What are some of the real methods? How do people go about doing this? And ask some intelligent questions and get some conversation going at them.
And there actually have been some times where I've been in a hangout with Steve and Jungle Jargon or some other atheists, and I think it was Nephilim. And people are really getting on the Jungle's case, or really getting on the Nephilim's case. And I felt like maybe the theistic position wasn't really being articulated in a way that people were understanding it. So then I take a shot at articulating it, and then sometimes it's actually like become a good conversation, at least for about 3 minutes. So I think we should definitely try that out sometime.
Yeah, Jungle would be another one. Like he has some kind of argument with a term, like specifically sequenced or something like that he says, and I can kind of sort of understand what he's talking about, but he makes extreme positions, I think, that are problematic. And the thing is, like, whenever you say, like, if I make an argument and I have 10 points, and one of them is like really extreme and crazy, people will ignore the other 9 points. They'll refute the really extreme point, and then they'll think they've refuted everything. Yeah. And that's the problem. Like, when you make a really extreme position, then your entire argument gets ignored.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's also just the problem of articulating the argument properly. I mean, the same thing happens. I mean, people will dismiss the way you said something, but they're not actually dismissing the argument because they've overlooked it because of maybe how it was worded. And so those have been times where I've tried to jump in and clarify the argument, which is a shame. I wish that people could articulate intelligent design a little better. But yeah, I just think people talk past each other. So we'll have to make it happen sometime. Get a couple of people in the chat at the same time. A diverse group.
Mass invite and see what happens. Like, even if you could get, but the thing is, though, you need to have at least like a couple. Like, if you could have a day's notice, you have a bunch of people in, no problem. Yeah. But like, even if you had an hour and you just like do a mass invite to around 20 people, you might be able to catch like a few of them, because you really only want like 1 or 2 from each side. Like, a room with 8 to 10 people is a madhouse.
Oh,
if
yeah,
they all want to speak. So if you have a couple of people who want to make sort of an argument against, and a couple of people argument for 4, like 2 and 2, 4 people, That's about as much as you can get. Any more than that, and it's either going to go a madhouse or people are going to get bored because, 3 or 4 people are speaking and 3 or 4 people are just sitting there idling. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll let you know when I set up that thing with Helena. Maybe on Monday evening, I might have a chance. I'll
yeah,
let you
just
know.
send me an invite. If I'm around, I'd like you to pop in.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Talk to you later, man.
All right. See ya.